My cousin Roberta and her husband Ferris are here this morning. If you look at us, you know we've been cousins for a very long time. Have lots of great spiritual conversations, and her dad was my crazy uncle. I'll say more about that in a minute. I also have here with me this morning my niece, Jamie, and her friend, Tori. And if you talk to her for very long, the irony is you'd hear some stories about her crazy uncle. We've been talking about fellowship, biblical fellowship, and we've striven to look at it from the standpoint of how it feels. Not defining what it is, but how it works. Being open and being transparent so that God in His great design accomplishes through the fellowship that He designed for us and our purpose. So this morning, I want us to look at fellowship as God looks at fellowship. What does He see in our fellowship? Not what we're doing right or wrong or what we're not doing or whatever, but as He sees us, what does He see? And that vision started back in the Old Testament. In fact, it started before He said, He ever said, "Let there be light." And in Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah gives us a great glimpse, a great vision of what's coming in this fellowship. And he looks at the coming fellowship as a mountain. And he says it's going to come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house will be established as the highest of the mountains. And it shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations, all the ethnos, all the ethnics will flow unto it. And there are going to be many people that are going to come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord's house, to the God of the house of Jacob." And get this, that He may teach us His ways, that we may walk in His paths. For out of Zion shall go the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between nations and shall decide disputes for many, many people. And they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And so in the latter days, in the coming days, this mountain is going to be established. It's a prophecy of the church, of the fellowship. And it's going to be taller than any other mountains. Nothing will challenge it. It's God's mountain. It's the mountain of His house. And when that happens, the nations are going to stream unto it. They're going to come. And they're going to say, "Teach us how to live. Teach us your ways. Teach us how to live." And the result of that is they will beat their wartime tools into peacetime tools. And then he says, "Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." Let's get this if we get anything. There's still war. And there's war that's as violent as it's ever been. There's destruction as violent as it's ever been. But not on the mountain. Do you hear what I said? Not on the mountain. The war that goes on, those nations need to come to the mountain and beat their wartime instruments into peacetime instruments and learn how to live in our fellowship, which is the mountain. That's what God purposed. That's what He built. That's what we are drawn to. And if you think about it, when you came to the mountain, what wartime instruments did you beat up, did you destroy? I had to beat my anger and my control into a peacetime instrument of love and grace and forgiveness. That's what happens on the mountain. And let's take a look at how God sees and what He purposed for that fellowship. If you'll turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. What we've been studying this whole weekend and what we will conclude with this morning is we need to revive in every aspect the fellowship that God has brought to us. We need to revive every aspect of the mountain. The world, the nations depend on it. If we don't do it, they're in big trouble. Our fellowship is that important. It's that significant. It's that eternal. And I'm going to scope a bit in chapters 1 and 2 of 1 Corinthians, and our text will be in chapter 3. Chapter 1, Paul will tell the church in Corinth what they are, what their very nature is. In other words, he says, when God looks at you, church in Corinth, this is what He sees. The fellowship in Ovilla, as God looks on you, here's what He sees. Don't care who you are, what you are. Don't care what you're struggling with. Don't care anything at all. Here's what He sees. Here's what He sees. Number one, that you're sanctified, set apart. Number two, that you're called to be holy. Number three, that you possess grace and peace. You don't have to go get it. You got it. You possess it. Grace and peace. He says the testimony about Christ is confirmed in you, in your fellowship. It's not confirmed anywhere else. Now get this. God's very specific. The testimony about Christ is confirmed in the fellowship at the Ovilla church. Identifiable in the Ovilla church. Not confirmed in the trees and the heavens and all of that. Paul talked about that in Romans 1. They declare God's glory. Testimony about Jesus is confirmed in you. Now in 1 Corinthians, with the exception of one or two times, every you that's used is a ye. It's plural. It's y'all. Not talking about me, it's talking about y'all. The fellowship. And when we put it into that context, you get it out of your backyard and you put it in who we all are. The y'all, it's ye, it's plural. He says, in this fellowship, as I see you, you've got every spiritual gift. Every one. You don't lack a one of them. And the spiritual gifts were given to build the fellowship. They didn't belong to individuals, they belonged to y'all. To build the fellowship. Because when the nations come to learn how to live, to be taught on the mountain, it's the gifts that will bring them in, teach them how to live. That's what happened to you, isn't it? Fellowship taught you how to live, certainly taught me how to live. The next one is you're blameless in the day of Christ, strong to the end. And get this one. This is the theme of our whole weekend. Called to fellowship in Jesus. Get on in here! That's what he says. As God looks at it. It's His fellowship the fellowship that He intended to be the mountain above all the rest of the mountains that the nations would stream to. As we go on in chapter 1, he says in verse 26, listen to how you were called to the fellowship. Brothers, listen up. Pay attention. I want you to hear again how you were called to this fellowship. He said, there weren't very many of you that were all that important, good looking, or dressed nice. Not many of you had attitudes or positions in life. Certainly didn't have a lot of assets. Weren't very important. And he said, God chose the things that are not to make nothing the things that people think are. It's just a flip. He says, on a scale of 1 to 10, you're 0. Now, you're 10 in my book, but in the world, you're 0. I'm going to give you a little grammatical lesson here that I think is very important. The word for are not there is the Greek character mu and the Greek character eta. It's a negative. So he says, I'm going to make you a mu eta, to make nothing of what everybody else thinks is powerful. I had a friend one time who made me a cap. I was going to bring it and I forgot. And stitched on the front was the mu and the eta. And he gave it to me and he said, every time you think you're something, just put this hat on. What he said is, Mike, when you get up in the morning, you look in the mirror and you say, you're just an old mu eta. Which is the power of God to make nothing that the world says is everything. That's our fellowship. A bunch of mu etas. A bunch of are nots. Which in God's book are the R's. Okay with the way I said that? It's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing because when the nations come to the fellowship with their war instruments, with their power, with their presence, with their assets, with their money, with their positions, with their knowledge, with their everything, they come to the mountain and they get a cap that has mu eta stenciled on the front of it. So they can be God's power in His fellowship. That's how He sees us. And so then, chapter 2, 1 to 5, is sort of an obvious progression. Paul said, well, you know, when I came to you, I wasn't a great speaker. I didn't speak with great swelling words of wisdom. I didn't come to you with the wisdom of the world of the R's. I came to you as an R not. And I came to you knowing one thing and one thing only, and that is Christ and Him crucified, that your faith might stand not in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. It's only the are nots, it's only the zeros that stand in the power of God. Those that don't do that depend on the wisdom of the R's. And that's been said over and over again. Doesn't work. There's no power. And the end simply has no end to it. And then as we go on, God says, let me tell you who this applies to. He says there are 3 types of people. And I'm in verse 14 of chapter 2. He says there are 3 types of people. There's the natural person, the soul-dominated person. That person depends on the wisdom of the world, depends on their own power. They cannot understand the spiritual because they don't want to, because their life is not after spiritual, it's after the wisdom of the world. So they can't understand the spiritual. The next person is a spiritual person who can understand the spiritual and does. Chapter 3, verse 1, Paul says, "Now I can't write to you as spiritual brothers." So he's talking to the spiritual, right? But he said, "I can't talk spiritual things to you because you're carnal. Got way too much of the world in you." He says, "I have to feed you milk, not solid food. You can't handle it. Can't feed you meat when all you can tolerate is milk." Now they're part of the fellowship. That means that in our fellowship, we got people that are growing. Got people that are still struggling with some worldly stuff, still carnal. They became Christians. And in this fellowship, that's what we train in how to live. With me? That was God's design for the fellowship. Well, I'm grateful for that because I should have been thrown out years ago. And I'm so very grateful that the fellowship never threw me out. They had the right to. Anybody with me in that? Huh. Then he talks about him and Apollos. He said, "You know, I planted, Apollos watered because we were building the fellowship." He didn't say, "You know what, I converted old Joe." No, God's the one that did that. You know what I did is I went over and served old Joe and watered what he'd been taught by Harry. A little water and a little planting and a little more water, a little more planting, a little more water, a little more planting. And God goes, boom! Here it comes. And so we move into a farming kind of view as God looks at this fellowship. So as we go on in chapter 3, he says in verse 7, "So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." I was always interested in that word, God's field, because in the context, Paul has moved into that farming illustration. And if you'll turn to Isaiah chapter 28 and verse 23, we're going to find out how God looks at this fellowship from a farming perspective. I think that this is one of the most significant things that you need to get from what we're talking about. You need to understand how God looks at our fellowship as a farmer. Isaiah 28:23. "Give ear and hear my voice. Give attention and hear my speech. Does he who plows plow continually? Does he continually open up and harrow his ground?" Now that's sort of a rhetorical question. No, he doesn't do that. But why didn't he do that? Well, I can tell you that when we moved to Massachusetts, I had a 14-acre farm. Never been on a tractor in my life. And there was an old garden that was out there where a barn had been, and I wanted to plow it. And my father-in-law bought me an old Ford F-01 Workmaster, about a 1952, had weighted wheels. I borrowed an 18-inch one-bottom plow and had to figure out how to put the silly thing on the tractor. And I didn't know what a top link was. Finally got that hooked up and plowed this garden rather precariously. It was about the size maybe of half this room. And then I didn't know how to break up the clods. Didn't, the turn road, the plow done. So I turned the plow sideways and tried to break it up that way. I won't tell you the rest of that story. I'm just going to tell you it doesn't work. And the neighbors got a real kick out of it. So he doesn't keep on plowing. He doesn't plow continually. He doesn't take the discs, the harrows, and keep on harrowing and harrowing and harrowing it. He gets that done. And he says, when he leveled its surface, does he not scatter dill, so coming and put the wheat in rows, and barley in its proper place, the emmer in its border? For he is rightly instructed, his God teaches him. Dill is not threshed with a threshing sledge, nor is a cart wheeled over coming. But dill is beaten out with a stick and coming with a rod. Does one crush grain for bread? No, he does not thresh it forever. When he drives his cart wheel over it with his horses, he doesn't crush it. This also comes from the Lord of hosts. He is wonderful in counsel and excellent in wisdom. What God presents here is his work in the field. It's a defined field. That's where he works. That's where he plows. That's where he discs or he harrows. That's where he plants. That's where he fertilizes. That's where he waters. That's where he harvests. And he doesn't do it indiscriminately. He plants the plants where they need to be planted. The little cumin and the dill planted on the outside of the field. When it comes time for harvest, he harvests just like they need to be harvested. Takes a little bag and a little stick and comes down around the cumin plant and beats it so the seeds come off in the bag. And he runs a combine over the corn. Right? You don't process dill with a wheat grinder wheel. And I can tell you in this fellowship, we need to appreciate when God plows our heart just like it needs to be plowed. When he runs the discs through it to break it up just like it needs to be broken up. When he levels it out. When he plants me here and harvests me there. The fellowship is the field. That's where he works. That's where the nations come to have their hearts broken apart. Not going to happen anywhere else. Like it needs to be done just perfectly. See, we need to appreciate deeply that we've been planted in the field of the fellowship. I'll give you another illustration. On this farm we had in Western Mass, Jamie has been there. It hadn't been farmed in about, maybe 100 years. It was an old onion farm. The house was run down, the fields were overgrown. I took that old Ford tractor and its one-bottom plow and started plowing this field. And the sod, when you turn it over, was just like this. There's no way in the world you're ever going to break that stuff up to plant something. And my intent was to plant cucumbers. In fact, we had 4 acres of cucumbers because there was a pickle plant down the road, and one of my neighbors was a pickle farmer, and he conned me into doing a pickle farm. Literally. So I'm out there working with this, plow it, finally got it all smoothed out, got the cucumbers planted, and I thought, man, are you kidding me? I did this? And then it all started. Cucumber plants would come up, and the pigeons would get them. Just nip them right down the road. Then the beetles hit. If you don't get the beetles in 2 days, your crop's gone. Then it rains too much. If it doesn't dry out quick, then nothing's going to come up. Then finally, when the things start coming up and you go, all right, I got a crop. The reason we did this was we wanted to have a youth ministry. We had about 7 or 8 kids in our youth ministry, and so we just figured we'd spend about 4 weeks in the summer, and they'd make a little money, and we'd have a youth ministry in the cucumber field. So we built this bed, had 3 mattresses on it, and the tractor pulled it through, and there was a little platform in front and 5-gallon pails, so we'd go through the cucumber, and they'd pick the cucumbers and throw them in the pails, and I was up on the platform, and I'd take the pails and dump them into the feed bags. And then we'd haul them up to the pickle factory. But here's what happened. We'd be going through the field, and there were snakes out there. They weren't poisonous. And I mean, when a snake had come across those cucumbers, it was like bedlam. Till it got to be kind of funny. And then the weeds hit. And there was this weed that when you touched it, it would just latch onto you. I know what it's called, I can't remember now. And the kids would start calling out, killer weed, snakes, killer weeds. In this field of cucumbers. You see, in our field, our tilled field with God the farmer, fellowship hollers out, killer weeds! Right? In the fellowship. World doesn't do that. Snakes, look out! World doesn't do that. But the Lord does in His fellowship and in His field. We need to deeply be moved that we've been plowed, harrowed, planted, and being harvested, and being protected by the farmer who designed it all. That's us. That's our fellowship. Doesn't get better than that. How do you live anywhere else? Then as we go on, in chapter 3, verse 10, Paul says, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building upon it. Let him be careful how he builds. For no one can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. In the fellowship, we don't know who is going to obey the gospel. We don't know who's got a heart for God. We don't know who wants to change their life. We don't know who desperately needs the fellowship, do we? And all kinds of people come. The precious metals are refined by fire. They just become more and more pure with the heat of the fire. The precious stones, when the fire hits them, crack. Look good, but they crack. The wood, hay, stubble, and as I'm teaching on this foundation, this cornerstone of Christ, am also hit with fire. Make sure what you teach is what the fellowship is, who Christ is, because it's all going to be tested by fire. Not someday, today. There's no difference in that and the plow running through your heart. I would hit clumps of dirt or soil with that 18-inch one-bottom plow that wouldn't break up. make sure that our prayer, our lives say, God, keep plowing my heart. Keep testing me with fire so that I, in this fellowship, am what you want me to be. So when the nations come, I, along with all of my brothers and sisters, are there. You okay with that? It's a good ride, brothers and sisters. Bottom line, there's not a lot of trouble. There's trouble. Killer weeds and snakes, right? But you know what we did on Saturday night after we finished with the cucumbers? We went up to Deerfield. We went to Wolfie's. Wolfie's had the finest hamburgers in the Connecticut River Valley. And our youth ministry and all of us would eat hamburgers and French fries, and there's never been better French fries and hamburgers till you eat them on Saturday night after you come out of the fields. Didn't remember the killer weeds or the snakes. And then as we go on, he says in verse 16, don't you know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. Once again, remember, it's the y'all. It's the ye that's the temple, not the me. Now, the me's the ye, right? But he's talking to the church. He's talking to the fellowship. And here's what he says. Don't you know that you are God's naos? The Greek word for the Holy of Holies. You are the Holy of Holies of Jehovah. Don't you know that? What he means is, I've always lived in the same place and I haven't changed residences. The Old Covenant, it was the Holy of Holies. That's where I was. And it hadn't changed. Y'all are the Holy of Holies of Jehovah. The fellowship at Ovilla is where God lives. It's the Holy of Holies of Jehovah. And let me tell you how serious he is that we know that. If anyone destroys that home of God, that Holy of Holies, God will destroy him. In 167 BC, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, sacrificed pigs on the altar in Jerusalem, desecrated the temple. He sent one of his henchmen by the name of Apelles to Modin to do the same thing. And when he got there, there was a priest by the name of Matthias. And Matthias wouldn't do it, and so he conned the other priests into do it. And Matthias killed that priest and killed Antiochus too. Over my dead body will you destroy this fellowship. That's how God sees this fellowship. That's where the nations are coming. That's where they're going to change their lives and be taught how to live. That's where the weak and the carnal can learn how to live and grow and mature. But it's not based on any other wisdom other than God's wisdom. And incidentally, when Matthias killed Apelles, that started the Maccabean revolt. Because nobody was going to destroy God's temple. In conclusion, this is pretty good news, wouldn't you say? God says this is who you are. Get there. Enjoy it. Grab hold of it. Try it on for size. Whatever adjective or phrase you want to put around it, it's what God's saying. And in Psalms 22, 24 and following, which is a psalm of a man being crucified, it's a look forward to Christ on the cross from the one that's on the cross looking out, not looking at him, but him looking out. He goes through all the horrors of it and all the things he's seeing. And then there's a transition in the psalm. He says, but I'm standing in the midst of the assembly giving my God praise. He went to the cross and endured the shame of it, because on the other side was glory unimaginable in the fellowship. That concludes the encouragement I wanted to give to you.